next up, we have Denise Knapp. And Denise is the head of conservation at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And she's kind of an ecologist extraordinaire, does a lot of work with how native pollinators interact with native plant species, and has really done some interesting stuff on what types of plants need to be available to support native pollinator species and vice versa. And so she'll give us a great overview of the native pollinators, native bees, their ecology, and also some of the things that we can do in our own landscapes to support these populations. All right, take it away, Denise.
All right, here I am. Thanks, Adam, so much. I'm really happy to be part of this project. So just gonna wait for my slides to come up. All right, so that's me. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And our mission is to conserve California native plants and habitats for the health and well-being of people and the planet. And I hope that through this talk, you'll see why that's important. Next slide. All right, just a slide of background. Insect pollination, who needs it? Well, almost 90% of flowering plants need it. And of course, that's transferring the pollen from the male parts to the female parts. And so transferring genetic material from one individual to another individual. So this cross-pollination, which is effectively kind of keeping them from inbreeding, which we know is bad, this makes these plants more vigorous and more adaptive to change. And of course, both of those things are really important in today's world. So next slide. Also, just from a purely practical standpoint, pollination produces our food, estimated to be worth $18 to $27 billion to us. Just a couple examples, apples, for instance, have to be cross-pollinated. And here's another example, is the next image is strawberries, which you can see on the bottom. The nice full plump strawberry on the left has been cross-pollinated. The others have been either self-pollinated or self plus wind pollinated. And I don't know about you, but I want to eat the strawberry on the left. And it's not just European honeybees, which is what most people think of when they think of bees and insect pollinators. I highlighted that these are European species and that they're actually an invasive species that has impacts on our native bees, of which there's about 1,600. So next slide. So bee diversity boosts crop yields. If there's one thing that I can leave you with today, is that it takes all kinds, is that biodiversity begets biodiversity. So having a bunch of different kinds of bees can do the job better. And for instance, this study here shows that different bees have different responses to weather, and that together that can stabilize the pollination services. So maybe this one doesn't like high wind and this one doesn't like the cold, but together they're really getting the job done. And in this study, it found that for wild bees, the number of different wild bees was even more important than how many there were. Next slide. Let's not forget about all of the different flowering plants in our wildlands, which maybe we're not eating, but I don't know anybody who doesn't enjoy seeing wildflowers on their hikes. So, and in turn, all of that habitat is supporting those pollinators that pollinate our crops. So it's a nice circle. Next slide. Brief intro to the insect pollinators. It's not just bees, although they're one of the most important pollinators because they go after both nectar and pollen to feed their babies. And they have a lot of structures that really help them carry that pollen. Butterflies can be pollinators, wasps and even ants can be pollinators, flies and beetles can be pollinators. Maybe they're not as good, but maybe they're servicing more flowers and there's more of them. They're more abundant and more resilient. So again, just the point that it takes all kinds. Next. And there's that message, it takes all kinds. If, for example, in California, there's about 1,600 different kinds of California bees, which seems almost impossible to imagine until you really realize that they can be tiny, they can be not that hairy, they can be huge, they can be everything in between. But here's an example, and that's bumblebees, which are really great pollinators. They are obviously big, they're really hairy. They also have pretty long tongues for a bee, and that means that they can access some flowers that are deeper, that are more complicated, and so achieve pollination that some other species can't. They also have a pretty long active season, so real hairy. They can actually do things like shiver and bask in the sun, and this means they can work in cool conditions, which makes them super valuable for that early time of year. So next slide. Another thing that bumbles can do that's super cool, and a few others can do, is buzz pollinate. So the image in the middle there shows the anthers of a plant, probably in the Solanaceae family, which you can see aren't covered in pollen. They're only open at the tip. And that means something needs to get that pollen out of that anther, and that's buzz pollination. So you can see in the images that the bumblebee grabs on, and it actually sort of disarticulates its wings from the flight muscles so it doesn't fly away, and then it shakes, which at about the frequency of a musical note of C. And this releases the pollen from those anthers. So you can see this is a pretty special thing. And we have a lot of things that we eat in this family, like tomatoes and also things like blueberries and cranberries also need this kind of pollination. Next. So just to show you a couple pretty pictures to get the point across of the beautiful diversity of different bees. This bee has a real long tongue. Next. And this bee has a shorter tongue, and so it can only access the shallower flowers. But maybe it has hairs in different places. It's different shape. It's active at different times. Next. Bees can be beautiful and colorful. They'll have different shapes and different hair placement. You can see all the hairs on the legs, which are important for transferring the pollen. And this bee will be using different kinds of species. Next. Some bees come in extra large form, like this big carpenter bee. Next. And you can just look at all of that pollen that these bees are carrying. They have these branched hairs and even kind of an electrostatic charge that makes them really good for carrying pollen. Next. But it's not just bees that can carry pollen. This is actually a fly. You might be surprised. It's kind of hairy there, and so it looks like a bee, but this is actually a fly. And I'll just confess that I'm especially in love with fly pollinators. Next. So another example of how it takes all kinds is that insect pollinators range from generalists to specialists. Here's an example of a specialist. So these are squash bees that only use plants in the Cucurbitaceae family. And if you look closely at them, you see that the pollen collecting hairs on their legs are a little sparser than a lot of other bees. And this accommodates the larger pollen grains of the squash and makes them more efficient at carrying the pollen around. Also, they carry that pollen dry versus European honeybees, which make kind of a bee bread with nectar, and they kind of mush it all up together. So the squash bees are actually more effective at carrying that pollen. Next. Okay, so they're important and they're cool, but they are in trouble. Next. Evidence is mounting that insect groups are declining in many parts of the globe. There's evidence from every continent except Antarctica. And just a little science aside here is that it's hard to measure this. It's hard to prove this. But evidence is just rapidly accumulating. There is enough to know that yes, there is a problem here. We have big headlines like the insect apocalypse, and indeed we do have some studies that show, for instance, in Germany, a 75% decline over the last 27 years in insect biomass. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember seeing bugs smashed all over your windshield, you don't even need to see this study. You know that you don't see that anymore. And we don't have the bug abundance and biomass that we used to. Native bees, 50% of wild species gone in one study. Butterflies, 50% decline over the last 2 decades. The list goes on. I've got a literature review and I'd be happy to share with any of you. Next. And this has real consequences for us. These are images of people hand pollinating fruit trees. And I don't know about you, but I just don't want it to come to that. And of course, this is expensive for us. And the insects are so well adapted to do this for us. Next. So what are some causes of pollinator decline? There's kind of a long list, and they actually interact with each other. When pollinators are weakened by one thing, they're more susceptible to another thing. I highlighted some of the biggies like habitat loss. I mean, we're just paving over a lot of habitat. It's just they don't have anywhere to live. The habitat that's gone is fragmented, and so it's in smaller patches and just not providing the same amount of resources. We are outright killing them with pesticides. We are transporting them around and introducing new pathogens. We're introducing pollution, including light pollution, which if you imagine yourself being a moth that's, traveling around at night, that could be pretty disorienting. We're introducing species from pathogens to competitors like European honeybees to introduced plant species that can be really badly behaved and become invasive and basically displace the diversity of native species that are supporting all these different pollinators. Sometimes we're overexploiting them, big pretty butterflies that we're capturing and selling. Climate change is a big one, which we just heard a lot surrounding the monarchs. And then co-extinction. One thing goes, and if it's tied to another thing, then that thing can go as well. So lots going on here. Next. Native plants and habitats and you are the solution. And if we can do this kind of work, planting native plants and habitats at our homes and doing widespread habitat restoration, we can address the habitat loss, the fragmentation. We can soften our impact in cities. We can, deal with invasive species by planting natives instead of those invasives and restoring diverse native habitat. And we can even have an effect on climate change when we're planting, replacing things with more carbon sequestration. Next. And, this makes sense because native plants and pollinators, they've evolved together. So these are images of columbine flowers, and you can see they have different lengths of what are called spurs for the nectar. And that corresponds to the different length of the mouth parts of these different creatures that pollinate them, which have shifted over time in some cases to from bumblebees to hummingbirds to hawk moths, which have the longest mouth parts or proboscis that can reach down into those real long nectar spurs. Next. Bees tend to like native plants better. Again, they take a range of generalists to specialists, and some don't care that much, but a lot do. He found that native plants are 4 times more likely to attract lots of native bees. Again, native bees have not evolved with the exotic plants, but also we've bred a lot of our horticultural plants to have reduced rewards. So maybe we want a bunch more petals on our roses, but that comes at the price of we don't want all of the anthers with all the pollen. Well, that pollen is the thing that these bees are eating. So that's a problem. Next. Let's not forget the butterflies and the moths, which start as larvae. We all know this. We've probably read The Very Hungry Caterpillar and know that, butterflies and moths start as caterpillars. And what do caterpillars eat? Well, they eat plants. And those caterpillars tend to be really specialized, which, as you can imagine, the plants are going to defend themselves, are going to evolve different defenses, and then the caterpillars are going to evolve defenses to get around those, and it's an arms race. And so these things are pretty specialized. So Dr. Douglas Tallamy is one of my heroes. He's written Bringing Nature Home, and one of his studies found that native woody plants support 3 to 14 times the butterflies and moths of introduced species. Next. I just want to slip this in here that floral diversity also attracts beneficial pest control insects. So we're talking about food gardens, food forests. We want to protect all of these plants from, pests getting out of control. And when we have that diversity, we're also attracting all of the things that can keep things in check. Native habitat attracts more beneficial insects, while weeds have been found to have the opposite effect. Next. How can you attract pollinators by creating habitat in your own yard? Here's a set of tips. Next. Strategy 1 is to plant a diversity of native species. So hopefully this follows more everything I've been saying, that diversity begets diversity. It also is providing resilience. Some things can do well this year with the weather this year, and some things will do better next year. Next. And when you plant them in clumps. So it's good to plant at least like 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. Plant a nice big clump of them for a couple of reasons. One is that it's easier for the pollinators to find them. And then the other is once they've found them, then they can stay and be really efficient and just feast. And it's all about energy conservation here. And so efficiency is the name of the game. Next. Strategy 3 is to cover the seasons. Try to have at least 3 different pollinator plants each for spring, summer, and fall. So I just give a couple examples of some beautiful natives that you could plant for spring. You might plant manzanita, some of the earlier bloomers and superstars for pollinators. For spring, summer, you might plant some sages like this purple sage here. And then for fall, there's fewer to choose from, but some superstars like this solidago or goldenrod. Next. Here's just a few examples of a potential planting palette for these seasons. Early spring, you might plant western redbud, different kinds of ceanothus, which is also called California lilac, shown on the right there. Lower middle, chaparral currant, lower left, manzanita. All beautiful, all great for pollinators. Next. And then the summer plant, yeah, I think we skipped one. There we go. Spring, summer planting palette. You might, this has the most to choose from. Sages are wonderful. Bush sunflower, lemonade berry, toyon, buckwheats are superstars for pollinators. Hollyleaf cherry, and then not labeled at the top there on either side is bush mallow, which is also great. Next. For summer, planting palette might include, again, goldenrod. California fuchsia is wonderful, especially good for hummingbirds. Coyote bush is wonderful for not only pollinators, but also pest control insects, and coffeeberry as well. Next. Tip number 4 meshes with what you heard from Karis: avoid pesticides. That's kind of a no-brainer. I know sometimes it's you can't avoid it, but avoid them as much as possible. And urban folk tend to use too much. So we would think that, oh, the problem is really just big agriculture. Well, urban folks are actually almost a bigger problem, because we think if a little bit is good, then more is better. And people use too much, and it runs off, and it's really having consequences for our native pollinators. And native bees are even more susceptible than honeybees, which you've probably seen all the dire headlines about, losing half of our hives every year, and colony collapse disorder. Well, native bees are having trouble too, and they're even smaller bodied and more susceptible to all these things. Next. Tip number 5 is to provide nesting habitat. So just like humans, we need not only things to eat, but we need a place to live. And 70% of native bees nest in the ground. So they need to be able to access that soil and dig out these nests. And so they need mulch-free areas. So I know mulch is great for controlling weeds and retaining water, and that's wonderful, but try to leave some mulch-free areas for the bees. The rest tend to use dead trees or stems and twigs and sometimes grasses. So leave the dead stuff, leave the leaves when you can. You can, tidy up the edges so it still looks like a nice, neat garden. But, it's all part of the life cycle there. I know a lot of people are really keen on putting in bee boxes, and it's a cool idea. You can drill these different size holes that are good for different kinds of bees. I would avoid it at home unless you are super committed to following up every year with detailed sort of sterilization, because we have the best intentions, but we can do more harm than good, and we can actually promote pathogens in this way if we're not super careful. Next. Strategy number 6 in the bigger picture is, maybe you don't have a home garden, you don't have that space, you live in an apartment. Support native habitat restoration. Get out there and volunteer and transform landscapes from bare earth or weeds to diverse native plants. You can volunteer for organizations like Channel Islands Restoration, UCSB. They've been transforming North Campus open space from a golf course to 136 acres of diverse native habitat. It's a wonderful success story. Growing solutions, and the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. We have a call out for volunteers right now to help us with a restoration project in the Los Padres National Forest. Next. And other conservation work. So the last story that I wanted to leave you with is next, about a rare plant. We do a lot of work trying to figure out who uses what, so we can do this better. This is the salt marsh bird's beak. It's endangered. It's found in high salt marshes. It's kind of a rare, showy, larger flower. You can see why it gets its name from these pictures here. Next. And this plant is a great example where it needs a larger bee to pollinate it effectively. So you can see the diagram there, how these flowers are kind of closed up. You can see it in the image on the right too. And so it needs a bigger body bee to kind of push its way in and to touch the parts in the right places to transfer the pollen. Next. So larger pollinators like this Melisodes bee are well suited for its pollination. You can see it on top of the flower, muscling its way in. And then you can see all that pollen on it and all of it that it's been gathering on its legs. Other smaller bees can cheat. So not all pollinators are created equally, or flower visitors. This little Lasioglossum or sweat bee can kind of come in the side in these little openings and not really necessarily touch the pollen where it needs to. Next. So we did a study repeating a study from 1985 that studied the pollinators of this rare plant, and that woman, Patricia Lincoln, found 4 different bees using the bird's beak, all 4 pictured here. The one especially most important was the wool carder bee, because it was especially sort of loyal to the bird's beak, and it would repeatedly visit that particular plant. And it was, it's a bigger bodied bee and it's effective at carrying the pollen around. So in 2016, we repeated this study, and unfortunately we found only 2 of these 4 species using the bird's beak, the 2 on the left that I've circled. The bumblebee was not present in our surveys. Even more worrying was that over the course of 15 hours of observation, we found only 5 individuals. That was a particularly bad year for the bird's beak and for a lot of things. So the good news is it wasn't quite as dire the next year that we did that study, but we're having more and more of those bad years, unfortunately. Next. So we looked in that study not only at who's using the bird's beak itself, which is in the lower right picture, but also what other pollinators are using what other plants. And we created this kind of network that shows on the top the different insects and on the bottom the different plants. And in doing that, we were able to identify 2 other plant species that are highlighted in yellow there. There's a phacelia and a deerweed that are also supporting this really important pollinator of the bird's beak, this Anthidium highlighted up top. And these are actually easy to grow. If we planted a ton of those and really supported that Anthidium, we could benefit the bird's beak while we're doing other things to try to recover this rare plant species. So I hope that that example just kind of illustrated how complicated these things can be, and all these little pieces count. Next. So I'm going to leave you with a video on a happier note. This is in some of our studies an endangered bumblebee, Bombus crotchii, unfortunately named, using the bird's beak in 2017. So if you guys could just turn on that video there. This was a better year for the bird's beak. You can see what a pretty flower it is, and what a nice thing it is to watch these bumblebees just shoving their way in there and pollinating these flowers. So it's cool, a rare species supporting another rare species. There's your moment of Zen. Next, last slide, just I didn't credit a lot of the photographers in this presentation that I just pulled shamelessly off the internet. So I want to thank them all and open it up for questions.
All right, thanks so much, Denise. And I think what people are starting to realize is just how detailed and integrated these systems are, and the fact that the devil really is in the details in terms of not only what species you plant, whether they're native or non-native, the other species that might be supporting that pollinator community. So one question I'll ask you is, based off kind of what we know a little bit associated with the native bee species and the European honeybee, and the fact that the European honeybee can basically be an invasive in kind of the natural systems, where they're something we very much depend on as kind of conscripted agricultural workers by going out and pollinating our crops for us. Are there examples of, or would people consider, for example, removing European honeybees from areas in order to protect and preserve native bee species?
I think we could consider it, but probably no one would consider it too heavily. I mean, they are important for agriculture. They have been removed in some isolated island systems like Santa Cruz Island, where, you know, it's possible. It's an island. We don't have agriculture going on out there anymore, and you can see the benefits. But I don't see that happening here on the mainland. However, you know, we, rather than encouraging them by, you know, adding hives, we could add habitat that benefits the honeybees and the native bees. So maybe there's other things that we can do to tip the balance a little bit.
And one thing I'll just mention too, that sometimes people run across a situation where they have European honeybees, for example, creating a hive in an area that might not be convenient for them. You know, it might be someplace right next to your house or in a garden, and it's maybe you have people in your family or friends that are allergic. You don't have to kill them or kill their hive to get rid of them. Chances are in your area, you have a beekeepers association, and we're lucky enough in Santa Barbara to have that, and they will actually come out and relocate that hive. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll trap the hive and they'll put it into a bee box, and then they'll place that box on somebody's property who wants to have the bees there for pollination and also for the honey. So there's some kind of more bee-friendly, ecologically friendly ways to relocate honeybee hives should that be a situation. Out of curiosity, I know a lot of people think of honeybees and think of hives. Do you, off the top of your head, know the kind of the percentage of bee species that produce these large social insect hives as opposed to being solitary, like many of our natives?
I don't know offhand the exact percentage, but I know the vast majority of our bees are solitary. The native bees are solitary. There's honeybees are pretty unique, and we think of them as how all bees work, but usually it's just, you know, a solitary bee with its nest and its babies. Sometimes there's kind of pseudo-social relationships. There's all kinds of different forms, and actually this book here is pretty cool, Bees, A Natural History. It goes through all the different kinds of bee biologies, but generally the vast majority of them are solitary.
Uh-huh. And so we did have a question, you know, again, a kind of a practical one, and I can understand where this person's coming from. When you have carpenter bees that are starting to kind of burrow their way into the eaves of your home and potentially cause maybe some level of damage, you suggest it's probably not a good idea to create your own bee nest sites because of the possibility of pathogens. If you wanted to try to attract the carpenter bees away from your home to something else, what might you suggest? Are there ways that you can do that that don't necessarily fall into that trap of potentially doing more harm than good?
Yeah, good question. I don't know about attracting them. There's two things I would say. One is you can just kind of exclude them. You know, you can cover that area with a mesh and just make it so they can't use that area anymore. But I have read actually in this very book I just showed you that what they do is pretty shallow. And so it's not probably going to affect the integrity of your structure so much. So you might consider just kind of letting them be. Um, no pun intended. Um, but yeah, I don't know about creating another structure for them. Again, I worry about the pathogens and think it's better to let them find their own thing.
Yeah. So another question is associated with GMOs and genetically modified crops, especially. And what, can you summarize kind of what we know currently about the effects of GMOs on native bees, native pollinators? Is anything, I mean, I know someone can answer some of that, but I want, you're more abreast of this information than I am.
Actually on that topic, I don't feel qualified to say.
Okay.
There's so much to know with pollinators, especially when you think about all the different kinds of pollinators, not just the bees, but and then the habitat. There's a lot to know and a lot to keep up on, and I don't feel like I have a thorough enough knowledge to even really say.
So, I mean, what I have read, and again, somewhat limited, but there have been some studies that have suggested that GMOs for general pollinator diversity are no worse than what we might call the kind of the chemically based agriculture that's out there. So they're not necessarily any worse than agriculture that uses pesticides, but generally an area that is using neither GMOs or pesticides is going to support a higher diversity, as you might expect. There was a lot of concern around genetically modified pollen and its impacts on wild butterfly populations. A fair bit of that has not really played out in kind of the natural ecology as opposed to what they found in the laboratory. And so I think there's still a lot to be done there and a lot to be looked into, but there wasn't seemingly as big of an impact in native natural populations as there was when they saw it in the test they did in the laboratory. And again, one of the other things that's challenging with that type of thing, just as you heard with the monarchs, is there's so many different impacts to an insect population, like, for example, migratory monarchs. Which one of those things is of greater priority to address in terms of conservation? And I think a lot of people are looking at climate change and habitat protection as still kind of the main ones. And some of these other ones are a little bit more secondary to that. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on probably the GMO issue, especially as they continue to expand, and especially as we start to get new versions of genetically modified organisms, because we have some that are, resistant to herbicides, but we also have some that have genes that are associated with them that make the plant itself into an insecticide. And of course, those are the ones like the BT corn that are of greatest concern when it comes to these non-target insects like some of these pollinators. So my hope is that research continues, but I think it is probably not, neither one of us are probably fully qualified to address that on a large scale. Or
I see a lot more literature on neonicotinoids and their negative impacts, which are varied, including even just kind of accumulating in the soil where we have ground nesting bees and all kinds of funky effects. It's showing up in honey and they've been banned in some places, and I think we should consider that here.
It says, if we have a small area to plant, are there plants that might give us a bigger bang for the buck for pollinators? Like, let's say you just have a balcony and a couple of pots. What might be, or do you have some recommendations for like the biggies?
Yeah, totally. So I'm gonna put a link in the chat to the gardens website. We have a page, Native Plants for Pollinators, and a list, a pollinator plant list for this region. But as far as bang for the buck, buckwheats are amazing and they're pretty diverse. So there's lots to choose from. Sages are also really amazing. And those are both smaller than, say, a Ceanothus or a manzanita if you're looking for something to put in a pot.
Yeah, and I'll attest to those buckwheats too. They're great. And then the one thing that I think sometimes people don't realize, you got to spend a little time looking close. There's a lot of really little pollinators that are fascinating to see. So even if you're not seeing like large bodied bumblebees visiting, take a closer look, spend some time, and you'll see some beautiful little flies and small native bees visiting. Great. So Denise, a question for you is, as we started to plant more natives and, in the garden at City College, and started to see more of these native bees coming in that weren't there before, because the area that we were planting on was a lawn at one point, they're coming from somewhere. And so it's like, how far will they travel? Do we know like how far they'll travel to find this habitat? And part of the question for that is, what we do in terms of looking at areas surrounding our gardens or our homes or our neighborhoods to support them on a larger scale. And also, as one of the things we're doing with this SBEE garden project is creating this kind of series of islands, like this archipelago of islands, in hopes that it creates kind of a larger scale habitat for these pollinators, because they can hopefully move to each of these different sites. But do we know at all like how far some of these native bees can travel in order to find suitable habitat?
Yeah, it really depends on their body size. They can fly farther if they're bigger. I was just reading honeybees like 5 to 9 kilometers, generally scouting around. So kind of a long ways. The great thing about pollinators is it really seems like if you build it, they will come. They find it. And pretty quickly, like they respond to habitat restoration within like a year or so. So that's the exciting thing, is that it works, as you've seen. So you asked kind of what can we do around us. There is a study that suggests that if we had just 15% of our landscape as natives, that would be enough to kind of bridge this gap in what you're saying, like the fragmentation. We've got natural habitat over here, and then we've got the city here. Well, if we softened our impact in the city by having like 15% of it be natives in our homes, in our commercial landscapes, in our parks, then that can ease that fragmentation. So tell two friends is what you can do.
And so, I mean, for those two that maybe are working or thinking about this on this larger scale, planning out, for example, a lot of us, if you probably have gotten some email from city officials at one point about, here's the 25-year plan for Santa Barbara, or here's, wherever you might live, and inviting people to come in and make comments. Is there any resource or anything that you can think of that they could go to or look at where it shows how you can create these corridors or these kind of archipelagos of habitat islands that can better support natives? And I think it was Eugene, Oregon, that had a project some time ago where they were looking at trying to create, in essence, corridors for mobile insect pollinators throughout the city, so that they made their city kind of friendlier to these populations and allow them to move. And especially with climate change, the more we allow them to move, the better. So is there anything that people can arm themselves with that might, they could bring to the table if they're sitting around with city staff or city officials and talking about what to do next, or how to plan, for example, a 25-year plan for a city?
Yeah, I would love as many advocates for this as possible, because the city is really good at promoting water-wise, but we can do so much better than just water-wise. Native plants are providing habitat too, and so if we could advocate for that, or there's some natives on their website, but it's not prominent, and there aren't enough, and there are conversations, but not enough. And so yeah, let's all advocate for this and have incentives to do more of this. So I guess you asked what are the resources, and there's a number of resources for kind of how you do it, and I'd be happy if anyone emailed me to send resources that I have and links and things. But I do want to see our governments getting more involved to really incentivizing this.
Mm-hmm. And we'll post some of those resources as well on our website. And I know Denise has put together quite a good list of native flowering plants and when they flower and what color their flowers are that I know we're following for some of our gardens, so that you can try to get to that point where we have a great diversity of flowers, flower types, and also getting that full span across the year to provide a food resource for the entire year for the native bee population. And the other thing, just, for the people that are, kind of joining us, botanic gardens can be great places too to buy plants. And I know the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden sells native local genotype species. And we're lucky enough in Santa Barbara too to have other sources. I source a lot of our plants in our gardens from Island Seed and Feed in Goleta, and they get a lot of their plants wholesale from Santa Barbara Natives, which does both ecological restoration work and also grows a lot of the native species from local genotype seeds. So you can, if you do a little bit of homework, you can usually find a nursery or a botanic garden near where you live that is going to specialize in native species and potentially even native genotypes. And they tend to be a wealth of knowledge in what might work in your area. And the other thing that we're hoping to do and using resources in the community is to put together a little bit more fine-grained list of both native and food-producing plants that work in some of our specific microclimates. So for example, City College is, on the mesa. We're going to have a different microclimate due to things like coastal fog than someone that might live, in the foothills. And that's another thing to consider when you're kind of planning your garden out, is you may have a different microclimate, different soil type, different sun exposure, even in a relatively short distance. So for the both speakers, is there any final lasting thoughts you want to leave with everybody as we tie things up in the next couple of minutes? I know I just put you on the.
I'll say something.
Yeah.
Something I wish I had put as a tip in my list was get involved with community science. So, we can, like I said, a lot of what we do is just learning more about who's on what are these networks, and how can we support who we want to support in our farms and home landscapes and things. So getting involved in community science, there's a number of things, helping gather data, on the different bees, like Bumblebee Watch as an example. There's the Great Sunflower Project, just observing these creatures, getting involved with iNaturalist, which if you can take a good enough picture, someone will tell you who this thing is. And you can go one step further. You can join a group that my friend and colleague created called the California Pollination Project. So you take a picture of a critter on a plant and you actually post it twice. Once for the plant and once for the pollinator, and you give information to link them, and then we can learn more, not only about where these species are, but who's using what, and really kind of go a little deeper into this to kind of rebuilding habitat.
Yeah, and I'll put another plug out for that iNaturalist process, because it's actually a lot of fun. There's a huge community of professional scientists and amateur scientists on there. And one of the great things about it is they will tell you what it is you're seeing if you don't know what it is, and you'll get a lot of responses to that. And people get really excited about new stuff. There's also Seek, which is a component of iNaturalist, where that is an app that you can use that with your camera on your phone. If you take hover it over a plant or something else, it'll actually tell you with reasonably good accuracy what it is you're looking at. So that's kind of having your own kind of scientist on your shoulder telling you, what this plant is, when otherwise you may not know. It actually can do that for you. And we'll try to put as many of those links too on the Explore Ecology website for these various citizen science type projects, iNaturalist, Bumblebee Watch, a number of others that are really good, both for you to get information, but also because these are massive data sets, and there's just so much more area that we can cover when we employ general citizens, general community, because there's only a limited number of biologists and their time to try to run around and see all this stuff.